This video will look at how the powers of the Prime Minister have changed from primus inter pares to a so-called presidential Prime Minister. Now, to use the phrase presidential can be an ironic term because in terms of formal powers, the Prime Minister of the UK certainly has more formal powers than the President of the United States. So don't think about it in that sense. Think about it presidential as in the Prime Minister has become a de facto head of state. On the next slide, you're going to see some opinions from former Prime Ministers about what they thought of their role. So, Gladstone, who was Prime Minister on 4 occasions over the course of 12 years, between 1868 and 1894, but was sort of had periods both in and out of that role, famously said that the Prime Minister has no powers over his colleagues. And then, if we fast forward almost 100 years, we've got Harold Wilson, who, like Gladstone, was Prime Minister on more than one occasion. He was Prime Minister on 2 occasions, first between 1964 and 1970, and then later between 1974 and 76. And he said that only a few Prime Ministers could be said to dictate to their cabinets. So what we see here is 2 Prime Ministers almost 100 years apart talking about the power that cabinet government has. And then if we fast forward to the modern era, it's Tony Blair, who served between 1997 and 2008, once said, "It is much easier to give the advice than take the decision." And what he's essentially suggesting there is it's much easier to be in the role of a cabinet minister rather than the role of Prime Minister. Talking about relations with cabinet, Herbert Asquith once famously said that a Prime Minister must be a good butcher, meaning that when the time comes, you need to end the political careers of cabinet members who have become a problem. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher was asked whether or not she needed to be a good butcher. She disagreed, but she said that she was good at carving the joint. And what she means there is reshuffling cabinet rather than essentially just removing troublesome individuals from it. So what does all of that tell us about the powers of the Prime Minister? Well, first of all, they can't demand obedience from cabinet. They have to make hard decisions over the careers of their colleagues and policy. They have to work hard to bring colleagues into line. They have to learn on the job. But most importantly, that it's a flexible role and that Prime Ministers are able to carve out their own leadership style. So let's have a look at some arguments that suggest that the Prime Minister has become presidential. And when we use that phrase, what we mean is that the Prime Minister has become more powerful over their cabinet. The idea that cabinet is now no longer a place for meaningful debate, but rather filled with yes men. And that phrase reminds me of Boris Johnson's first reshuffled cabinet, which was almost entirely stacked with Brexit-supporting members of Parliament. Boris Johnson didn't feel a need after the 2019 election to have Remainer voices within cabinet, and he was powerful enough and in a powerful enough position to have an overwhelming Brexit majority within cabinet. And you may see someone that looks scarily like Boris Johnson, and that's because his brother can be spotted there, top right. Mo Molan once famously said in 2002 in a documentary with the BBC that cabinet itself is dead. It doesn't have a role to play. And you must remember here that Tony Blair was famous for his so-called sofa government. And this is where Tony Blair, with other key members of cabinet like Gordon Brown and Home Secretary Jack Straw, would meet outside of cabinet meetings. And so the idea that the Prime Minister has reduced the role of cabinet is long-standing. We could go back even further and look at the Thatcher years. Thatcher was seen as intolerant and autocratic and treated cabinet not as a place for debate, but where her message was going to be put across to a wider group. Thatcher famously described what she believed to be the awkward members of cabinets as wets, and placed loyal so-called dries into prominent positions. The most famous of the wets is Michael Heseltine, who resigned from cabinet in 1986 and became an outspoken critic of Thatcher as a backbench MP. He didn't return to cabinet until John Major was Prime Minister in the 1990s. And of course, you'll remember from a previous video how David Cameron formed the Quad, which was himself and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, alongside the two prominent Liberal Democrats in the coalition government, Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander. All of these examples suggest that cabinet is becoming less influential and prime ministers are using various methods to increase their standing. Another phenomenon that has decreased the role of cabinet in particular is the role of SPAD's, special advisors. Now, these have been around since the 1960s. It was the Prime Minister we looked at earlier, Harold Wilson, who introduced these personal political appointments to support the Prime Minister. But in the 21st century, that's when we've seen their influence grow. We have to start with Alistair Campbell, who was known as Tony Blair's so-called spin doctor and was in charge of ensuring that media relations for the Prime Minister were particularly friendly. He was the official spokesperson for Tony Blair from 1997 to 2000 and then became Downing Street Director of Communications from 2000 to 2003. Theresa May famously relied on Fiona Hill and Nick Timothy in her brief time as Prime Minister. And Boris Johnson, we looked at the role of Dominic Cummings in a previous video, and if you haven't seen it yet, I explain why this speech in the Rose Garden proved to be so controversial at the time. But two other special advisors, certainly after the spectacular fallout between Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson took place, were Sir Edward Lister, who was Johnson's chief strategic advisor, and Munira Mears, the director of the Downing Street Policy Unit, who'd also worked with Boris Johnson as the Deputy Mayor of London. And what all six of these individuals have in common is that they were able to enjoy a close, personal and long-standing relationship as a political associate of their respective prime ministers. And when prime ministers have these special advisors to rely upon, that it decreases the role of cabinet naturally. However, we can still see examples where prime ministers are not enjoying the strength that has been described in the previous slides. And it all comes down to circumstance. When we think of weak prime ministers, we must think of Theresa May. She never enjoyed a majority in the Commons as Prime Minister after the 2017 general election. So she became Prime Minister in 2016 with a slight Commons majority, but the snap election of 2017 meant that that was lost. What that meant is that she consistently had to keep the warring factions of the Tory party together. And as a Remain MP, now Prime Minister in charge of getting a Brexit deal for the United Kingdom, she had to walk that tightrope where she was keeping both Remainers and Brexiteers happy. In July 2018, she managed to get Cabinet to agree to the so-called Chequers deal over Britain's exit from the European Union. Two ministers who originally agreed to that deal, who later resigned in protest over it, were her Brexit Secretary David Davis and Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. Now, they're two significant resignations for two reasons. One, it's her Brexit Secretary resigning over a Brexit policy. So if there's any department relevant there, it's David Davis's. And of course, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson had consistently been a thorn in the side of Theresa May as the Brexiteer poster boy for what Brexit may or could be. And so Theresa May tried to keep Boris Johnson on side by bringing him into cabinet as Foreign Secretary, but his resignation gave her opponents somebody that they could centre their opposition to her around. Two attempts were made by Theresa May to get her Brexit deal through the Commons in 2019, and without a majority and significant rebellions from her own Conservative backbenchers, those two attempts failed, and it would lead to her eventual resignation. But even strong MPs who appear to be in a position of strength can find their positions change very quickly. Thatcher had been in power 11 years by the time of the poll tax. The poll tax introduction of 1990 led to riots up and down the country because it was a flat fee to be paid by all taxpayers. And the poorer members of society saw that as unfair. It eventually forced her out of office. She survived a challenge to her leadership in 1989 when backbencher Sir Anthony Mayer stood in opposition to her. But she had 314 votes amongst Conservative Party MPs. Just a year later, her old foe and wet Michael Heseltine challenged her for the leadership. Thatcher actually won more votes than Heseltine, but it was only 204 to 152. And that led to Margaret Thatcher resigning as Prime Minister. And what had changed between 1989 and 1990 was that the public's image and impression of her had changed significantly as a result of the poll tax riots. We can also see it with Tony Blair, who enjoyed huge Commons majorities in his time as Prime Minister, but by 2008 the Iraq War was increasingly unpopular, and he resigned in 2008 and was replaced by Gordon Brown. My apologies, that's 2007. He was replaced in 2007 by Gordon Brown. So we've got a weak Prime Minister who always struggled, but what we can also learn here, what Thatcher and Blair had in common, is two long-standing, powerful Prime Ministers brought down by events, and possibly Prime Ministers that just outstayed their welcome and were in the job for too long. So finally, let's have a look at the debate in the textbook on page 73 on how far the role of the Prime Minister has changed. On the left, you'll find arguments to suggest that it has, and on the right, that it has not. So first of all, it makes the point of a presidential style of Prime Minister where Cabinet is being bypassed in favour of SPADs. But also that our Prime Ministers have become celebrities. I mean, the fact that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is colloquially referred to as Boris suggests that we have a closer relationship with Prime Ministers than they possibly enjoyed historically. Of course, as well, we've come closer to party leaders and Prime Ministers as a result of party election debates, but also the growth of social media too. On the other side, there have been no formal changes, no legal changes to the power of the Prime Minister. And we often focus on powerful PMs like Thatcher and Blair, but we must also think about those Prime Ministers who didn't enjoy the same power. Maybe David Cameron, who 5 out of 6 years had to manage a coalition government, or Theresa May, and even more recently, Liz Truss. The influence of SPADs is somewhat exaggerated, and you could possibly look at when crisis hit. Individuals like Dominic Cummings during the coronavirus pandemic eventually became less powerful, and Boris Johnson relied upon key government ministers like the Health Secretary at the time, Matt Hancock, and medical experts like the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty. And then finally, when we're talking about an age of social media and a media-savvy Prime Minister, it's good and it reflects well in the press if the Prime Minister comes across as collegiate and collaborative, willing to work alongside those relevant members of Cabinet. And again, we could go back to the example of Boris Johnson, who would often appear at the COVID-19 briefings with individuals like Sir Patrick Vallance, Jonathan Van Tam, Professor Chris Whitty, and Matt Hancock too. So a media-savvy Prime Minister knows that it is good to be seen to be working well with your colleagues.